In 1945, the American Museum of Natural History held an exhibit depicting the scientifically perfect male and female human bodies. Named Norman and Norma, the two stone sculptures were represented what is normal. That is what scientists determined was normal for humanity. Norma was neither voluptuous nor skinny, but just the right size to carry a fetus to term. She was created by a gynecologist in a sculpture who considered white, heterosexual, able-bodied women with just the right size to be the only acceptable norm. And norm didn't mean average. Norm meant right. Particularly right for the passing on of the best genes. In other words, the exhibit was the product of what was once called eugenics. Eugenics was a fake science in the early 20th century that claimed that if we only bred the best people, the right people, we could have a kind of evolutionary leap as the human race, and we could create only the best children. And best was considered white, heterosexual, and able-bodied men and women with just the right proportions. In other words, Norma and Norman weren't merely exhibits saying what, say, healthy humans might look like. They were rather defining what beauty was, what good genes were. And thus, these exhibitions were designed to exclude certain other bodies that didn't fit the norm, i.e., non-white, non-heterosexual, non-able-bodied bodies. Not to mention elderly bodies that could no longer reproduce life. The eugenics scientists pushed that anyone who didn't meet the bodily standards should be sterilized. More, those who did not fit these standards, it was proposed, should be stripped of citizenship, even though almost no one, male or female, had these just right Goldilocks bodies. In other words, Norma and Norman indicated who was chosen, who was truly American, who belonged, including to the human race. The reality is that the right body has always been an identity marker. Women can tell you this from the earliest ages, that their bodies are shoved into, fit into certain molds and certain looks. Men don't usually get that until a little bit later in life, but the pressure is never on us the same way it is for women. But in every society, there is something about the body that marks belonging. In America, the obvious marking is historically indicated by race or skin color. But in other countries, belonging might be marked by tattoos, neck elongations, your weight, your foot size, your clothing. Ancient Israel marked bodily belonging by circumcision and therefore functioning reproductive organs and even piercings. Your body carried certain markings that indicated that you belonged to us or you were excluded from us. But the markings also indicated that even if you belonged to us, they indicated where you belong in the hierarchy of society. For example, circumcision is only something that men can experience, at least in that way. This idea of bodily marking indicating who belongs to us and who doesn't was even more important for ancient Israel because they were the chosen people. The status of chosenness was marked on their bodies both by circumcision and by other ethnic identifiers, including able-bodiedness and functioning genitalia. But the notion of divine chosenness is not neutral. It's also fraught. Because chosen people, or people who think they're chosen, almost always judge themselves as the norm for all other humans. And anyone who gets judged, and everyone else gets judged, by how they do or do not line up with what I consider normal. Now, when we start talking about bodies and the way bodies look and the way bodies behave and the way bodies function as an indicator of insider versus outsider, who belongs and who doesn't, all of a sudden we see that all over this place, don't we? Why don't men wear skirts? Because it's a marker on my body which says what I belong to and what I don't. Jesus wore long, dress-like things all the time. Because in his culture, that was not a marker of masculinity or femininity. Everyone did it because you had to, because it was hot. But men in America, suddenly a male dresses like that, and we say, oh, we don't know how to classify them now. Do they belong with us in the male category, or do they not belong with us in the male category? But they have male genitalia, but they don't dress like a man, and so they belong to us, but they're not. They don't really belong to us, and they're excluded from us, and we don't know what to do with it. And next thing you know, we're talking about kids peeing in litter boxes in classrooms on the media, right? Because we just freak out anytime somebody doesn't fit what we think is normal. And thus we read in this awkward passage in Deuteronomy 23 where sexual organs are damaged and therefore we're not normal. Those folks were excluded from worship in ancient Israel. Or in the history of Collins Chapel, right? Your body doesn't look like ours, so you can worship somewhere else. You can worship in the basement, but you don't belong to us in the same way, right? That's not just our church. That's our entire society. It's the history of our society. And it wasn't just bodily markings, sexual organs that didn't function right. It was ethnic identity markers or ideological identity markers in Deuteronomy 23 that essentially said you belong to ancient Israel or you don't. The ideal Israelite in Torah was a circumcised, able-bodied descendant of Abraham or a woman who could bear the children of a circumcised, able-bodied descendant of Abraham. And these were not just norms, they were markings of belonging to us and supposedly markings of belonging to God. And that is what makes Isaiah 56 fascinating. It is mind-blowing. I don't know, maybe when Marty was reading, maybe we were distracted by the fans, maybe we were just yawning because we just think we already know what the Bible says and it bores us, especially Isaiah 56 with his Isaiah and his 60-plus chapters of long flipping prophecy that nobody knows what's going on, right? And so we just yawn and Isaiah 56 is absolutely countercultural. It changes everything, and I would argue that it is a precursor to everything that Christians should believe about belonging. Isaiah 56 is written 1,000 years after Deuteronomy. And it re-raises the question of who belongs. But it moves the question away from how does your body look? How does it present itself? What tones of skin does it have? What gender does it have? Does it fully function? It moves the question away from what does the body look like to how does the body rest? For context, the question of belonging in Isaiah 56 is really important. Because by the time you get to Isaiah 56, you have Jews who had never lived in the promised land, right? So the monarchy was ended because the Babylonians and the Assyrians came in and destroyed Israel, right? And what they did was they took the best, the brightest, the royalty, the smart people, and they dispersed them all throughout the Babylonian Empire. And they lived there for generations. But by the time you get to Isaiah 56, it's 1,000 years after Deuteronomy is written. It's hundreds of years after the exile. And Babylon has decided to allow the Jewish exiles to return home. But this raises all kinds of identity questions. Can a person whose body has never lived in this space belong to us? They're as foreign to us as any immigrant who crosses the border. We might share some of the traditions, but even they're reading Babylonian philosophers. They're not reading Moses the same way we are. Culturally, we're different. We're physically different. Our experiences are different. They're probably compromised with foreign Babylonian women. Do those who have never lived in the promised land belong to us? And what about if they didn't follow the customs all the way? What if their sons aren't all circumcised? Do they get to belong to us? Or Deuteronomy has this weird passage about crushed genitalia. Well, we know that in Babylon, they made eunuchs. They physically cut off someone's manhood so that those men could not reproduce. They can't perpetuate the lineage of Abraham. They can't circumcise their sons because they can't even have sons. And probably more likely, the reason you were made into a eunuch is so that you could serve the Babylonian queen without being a threat to assaulting her or creating a child who would be a threat to the king, the lineage, right? In other words, eunuchs were often people who worked closely with Babylonian royalty and politicians. So they're compromised ideologically and politically. They are a threat to us, and yet now they're coming home. Can they belong to us? And this is even more important because ancient Jews believed that the reason God had allowed the Babylonians to overtake them to begin with was because they had compromised with foreigners. They had compromised with foreigners by worshiping foreign gods, by adopting foreign philosophy and foreign politics. And so defining who belongs to us politically, ideologically, religiously, even physically, defining who matters to us has massive implications as these people return to the land. And here is the wild part. Isaiah 56 is utterly uninterested in religious purity attests. It is utterly uninterested in somebody's political allegiances. It is utterly uninterested in someone's economic status. It is utterly uninterested in Deuteronomy's rules about crushed man parts and ethnicities that don't belong. Instead, Isaiah 56 says that both foreigners, including those who once betrayed your people, both foreigners and eunuchs can belong. Foreigners, which Torah regards as ethnically and religiously impure, foreigners who don't understand our customs and our traditions and our history, and they seem to be invading our land against our will, they can belong. And eunuchs who were excluded based on Deuteronomy 23:1, whose bodies don't fit nicely within the male-female categories, who didn't have bodies that could reproduce Abraham's lineage, and who are likely politically compromised when they lived in Babylon, they can belong too. This is a radically open vision of what God wanted for ancient Israel and the kingdom of God. Torah defined belonging according to ethnic lineage, religious faithfulness, and bodily norms, and Isaiah completely disregards all of it when he defines us. Instead, the one marker of belonging was Sabbath keeping. Isaiah said, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath, who choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. Are you catching what Isaiah's doing here? Paul's gonna say it later. You think you're the sons and daughters of Abraham because you carry his DNA and you circumcised your sons. And God is saying in Isaiah 56, there is something better than sons and daughters. Sabbath keeping. And then he says, foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it and hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain. Foreigners into the holy mountain, that is the promised land, and I will give them joy in my house of prayer. They will be fully welcome as worshipers who belong to me, even though they don't carry Abraham's DNA. All of the us versus them markers of all that Isaiah could have chosen, he chooses not circumcision, not ethnic identity, but Sabbath keeping. And that seems really weird. Unless you've been listening to me preach these last 6 weeks, in which case I hope you're saying, yeah, that seems like the obvious choice. And even if you've been listening to me preach for the last 6 weeks and you're like, I still don't get why it's the obvious choice, let me unpack it. Sabbath matters because it is the great leveler of who belongs and who does not. On Sabbath, your ethnicity, your social status, your gender, your able-bodiedness do not matter because everyone gets to rest in God's goodness. It is a day where there is no hierarchy because rich and poor, master and slave, even the animals get to rest. It is a day where there is no hierarchy, where the norms of your body do not matter, where production ability and buying power do not matter at all. It is a day where humanity is defined by God's provision rather than human productivity. And therefore, it is a day where bootstrap economics and race-based hierarchies are set aside for justice for everyone who belongs. And everyone does belong. The truth of Norma and Norman is that no one is actually normal. And defining who gets to count as normal is just one way of trying to protect your identity instead of being open to the vast diversity of the world God has made. There is no ideal body. Just as there is no ideal citizen, just as there is no ideal Christian. We assume we know what normal means, but we don't consider that normal has always been a moving target designed to keep us buying and to keep us excluding each other so that we can all be controlled. But on Sabbath, normal is redefined around recognizing that whether you're wealthy or you're poor, whether you have a house or you don't, whether you have mental health needs or you are the rare person who's mentally healthy, Sabbath is defined around recognizing that we are all 100% dependent on the God who created the world and is rescuing the world. And that means all of us are the us. And it's something I think Christians, we believe is fully realized in Jesus Christ. Do you remember in the New Testament when Paul was going around ancient Greece and ancient Asia Minor and he was starting all those churches? And the first place he would go, he'd go to the synagogues and preach to the Jews, right? Jews who didn't live in the Promised Land, many of whom had never been to the Promised Land. So he goes around, he gets some converts from the local synagogues first, and this is how he starts his church. But then he says this gospel story is open to the Gentiles too. And so he starts preaching in the marketplaces, right? And then these churches start to get filled with Jews and Gentiles. And the first thing the Jews obviously want to know is, what? Right. Yeah, why? Because are they circumcised, right? Circumcision is a matter of belonging. It's not just, it is, are they circumcised? But it's, are they circumcised, meaning do they belong to us? Or is there a hierarchy in the Christian faith between people who are circumcised or not? Because then that would exclude women. See all the implications? So what does Paul do? They say for these Gentiles that belong to us, they have to be circumcised, which indicates that they're chosen by God along with us. But Paul's argument was that belonging to Christ, like in Isaiah's vision of belonging to Christ is not a matter of bodily norms. It wasn't about race, it wasn't about sexual identity, it wasn't about gender, it wasn't about foot size, it wasn't about able-bodiedness. It was about whether we are willing to lay aside our hierarchies and our criterion of normal from belonging in the human, and our criterion of normal and rest in the God who was excluded from belonging to the entire human race when he was put on the cross. Do you see what the cross is for Paul? It's not just a transaction between Jesus and God whereby Jesus makes sure that we receive forgiveness. In the cross, Jesus is literally marked out as the complete other who's not even human. And in this one who is utterly rejected by humanity, God says, through that rejected one, I will make sure that everyone can belong. That is the foolish scandal of the cross, according to Paul. that the rejected one is the one who is given power to reconcile the entire world to God. The one who was excluded, the one who was never white, the one who was never heterosexual in the sense that we don't have any record of Jesus kissing girls. The one who never waved an American flag. The one whose body on the cross was anything but able-bodied. Through that one, God began a new community where belonging was rooted only in resting in the goodness of God's neighborly love and then sharing that goodness with our neighbors. So, today I leave you with this. The body that truly belongs to God is not the one that fits some fabricated mold of normativity, but it is the one that rests fully and freely in the love of God. In Christ, the marks of chosenness are no longer carved into the flesh, but are written into the hearts that surrender and rest in the grace of God. Sabbath reminds us that week after week we are not defined by what we produce, by how we appear or how we compare to others. We are defined by the God who receives the eunuch, the foreigner, the misfit, the outcast, the poor, the God who welcomed even crucified, crushed flesh as an act of worship. So let us become then the kind of people who resist false norms, who reject exclusionary ideals of who belongs and who doesn't, and who practice Sabbath not just as a day of the week, but as a very way of being, where everyone gets to belong and everyone gets to rest in the holy love of God.